All right, just for troubleshooting, couple of quick questions for our participants. How many of you have attended a webinar in the past? If you have, raise your hand using the raise hand icon in the middle of your screen at the top. Okay, looks like we have about 5 folks who say they've attended, 6 folks who say they've attended more webinars in the past. Excellent. Now, lower your hand only if this is your first Buck Institute for Education webinar. Leave your hand raised if this is not your first Buck Institute for Education webinar. Wow, so it looks like 3 of you have attended Buck Institute for Education webinars in the past. 2, 3, great.
4.
A few of you have attended other webinars, but not by the Buck Institute for Education, and a few of you, this is your first webinar, so welcome. We're excited to have you. Excellent. So just a little bit about our audience. It looks like 3 of you are just getting started with project-based learning. Wonderful. We're glad that you're getting started with the Buck Institute for Education and this webinar on managing projects. It looks like 9 of you have some PBL under your belt. Perhaps you've launched 1 or 2 projects, or perhaps you launched 1 or 2 per year. Also looks like we have a good mixture of elementary, secondary, and administrators. Looks like 3 people have selected other. If you could put in the chat section what your role is in the field of education, we'd love to know. Okay, so I'm going to hide these polls, and we're going to go ahead and get started with the Buck Institute for Education webinar on managing projects. Welcome once again. My name is Charity Allen. I'm actually attending this webinar, presenting this webinar from Seattle, Washington in the United States. I am a senior Buck Institute for Education national faculty member. I support project-based learning work all over the United States as well as internationally in Alberta, and we have an Alberta participant, welcome, in British Columbia, and soon in India and South Korea. So very exciting work. I support large district initiatives as well as individual schools who are taking on project-based learning initiatives. So I provide PBL 101 trainings, follow-up support, leadership coaching, and even sometimes one-on-one support in project design and implementation with teachers. Myla, do you want to tell us about yourself?
Absolutely. Hello, my name is Myla Lee, and I am a national faculty member. I have been teaching for over 20 years, and I'm in the classroom right now. I'm a 3rd and 4th grade teacher, but I have experience teaching 1st, 2nd, and 5th grade. I do project-based learning in my classroom, and I develop the units and implement them. I do coaching at a district level as well as with the Buck Institute. I thoroughly enjoy integrating technology in my projects as well as really infusing literacy throughout it as well. And I'm currently coaching middle school teachers with Michigan Champions, which is a state initiative for project-based learning with STEM.
Excellent. So just from a logistics standpoint, obviously we understand that managing projects looks different depending on which level, which grade levels you teach. And so what we will be doing is we will be sharing a variety of slides with you, and then we will each respectively share the secondary perspective and the elementary perspective. So we think that project-based learning can look different in the lower elementary grades and the upper elementary grades and then the secondary grades. So Myla primarily will be sharing on the elementary perspective of managing projects. I will be sharing on the secondary perspective of managing projects. Little shameless plug here. We wanted to let you know that this webinar will be available for your review at this YouTube website here. We actually post all of our webinars in our BIE YouTube channel. And so you can access our archived webinars there. You can access this archived webinar at the YouTube channel. Additionally, if you're a member of our Edmodo project-based learning community, you may already know that you can access archived webinars on Edmodo in an archived folder of webinars. So we're going to take a look at which need to knows we're going to be addressing during this webinar. Here are some typical need to knows regarding project management. The National Faculty for the Buck Institute for Education, we facilitate project-based learning 101 workshops all over the United States and all over the world. And what we found is that these tend to be really common questions that teachers have regarding how to manage projects. So Myla and I will attempt to address each of these need to knows, again, both from the elementary and the secondary perspective. For example, what does a project look like from day to day? What's the ebb and flow? What's the daily flow of a project? How do I launch the project with an engaging entry event? How do I create teams?
In addition, we're going to also need to know, how do I manage project documents and how do I avoid common project pitfalls? Charity, will you share what the very first day looks like in a secondary classroom?
Sure. So this is a typical first day in what I might call a well-established project-based learning classroom. So depending on factors such as your students' experience with project-based learning, factors such as the duration of your entry event and the length of your classes, this potentially could extend beyond a single day. But the big idea here is this is what would happen first in a project. So the first thing you're probably noticing is that projects always begin with an entry event. So a lot of teachers I know feel compelled to front load or pre-teach content associated with the project. We discourage this. The key is to use the entry event to create a need to know the content and a need to do the project work. Again, the need to know is a student's perception that they need to know and do the work associated with the project. If you quote-unquote pre-teach content, students won't necessarily have a need to know or do yet, and so learning might be shallow or decontextualized. So we really encourage you to start with an entry event, to jump in, even though students might have some knowledge gaps, so that you can create the need to know on the first day for the learning that will occur in the project. Once you have that need to know or do created by your entry event, it will be important to document and anchor students' questions, students' need to knows about the content and process. So one way you can do this is by using a whole class need to know chart, or in some cases, teachers facilitate the creation of group or individual need to know journals. Quick raise of hands if you have done group need to knows in your classroom with a project. So whole class need to knows. Okay, raise your hand if you've facilitated individual need to know journals. Okay, so pretty common early on in your PBL career to do whole class need to knows. As you get further in the process, it might make sense to ask students to document group need to knows for their project team, or even individual need to knows in project journals. In either case, whether you use a whole class anchor chart or group or individual journals, this will document the evolution of students' need to knows throughout the project process. So that's the second step. Third step, project teams are announced. Early in a student PBL career, it may be necessary to discuss and scaffold the team process. Some teachers use the fishbowl format to model a team meeting or the process of writing a contract before asking students to do it by themselves. Something to think about if students haven't had that experience. Next, we discuss expectations for teamwork. So what could that look like? Some teachers engage students in team building activities. Following the team building activity, they ask students to describe what worked and what failed in that team building process. From there, it can be possible to distill what students articulate into collaboration norms. Those collaboration norms can be referenced throughout the project and even used as language as students develop contracts. So the final step there is asking students to engage in their first team meeting and develop contracts and/or initial task lists. So usually the first deliverable in secondary PBL is the team's contract. And a second deliverable might be that initial task list or a list of project deadlines. We want the kids to be able to know what they're going to produce at the end of a project and know some of the initial step-by-step deadlines along the way. So we know that this first day or beginning of a project process can vary between the elementary grades and the secondary grades. Myla, do you want to talk a little bit about what a project launch looks like in the elementary grades? Myla, I think you're muted.
I'm muted, sorry. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Unlike a secondary classroom, the first day of an elementary classroom actually becomes the first 3 days. So what you see on the screen actually is 3 days of your calendar. The scope and sequence of those initial activities depends on 3 things. On the time allotted each day for the project. Depending on how your day is structured, sometimes you may only have 1 hour per day. Sometimes with integration, you might have a big block of time. So that's something to consider. The length of an entry event. I'll talk a little bit more later about what an entry event's like, but if an entry event is 30 minutes versus maybe 2 or 3 hours, depending on that depends on what you're going to be doing those first 3 days. And whether you're working with early elementary, such as K2 or upper elementary, younger grades need more scaffolding and explicit instruction, and perhaps whole group guidance throughout every step. One example of the first 3 days of an elementary classroom might look like this. On the first day, the entry event is you launch your entry event. And then after that, you start creating the need to know list, just like Charity was mentioning. Many times for the need to know list, when you're first starting, you're going to do that whole group, especially for the early grades. As you get older and as you have more experience, I know in my classroom, I do a whole group as well as a personal journal for the need to know. Sometimes I even actually have the kids develop the needs to know beforehand, and that helps create that bigger need to know piece for our whole class. Now, project teams are announced and expectations are discussed on the second day. Now, this is just one example. And the first meeting and initial activity would happen on the third day. Now, in terms of team building, such as Charity was mentioning with secondary, much of that is established in the first day of school. Many times throughout the year, we're just revisiting team building activities. That first day of school, when you have your get-to-know activities, circle time, and morning meeting activities, that's all part of creating that culture, that team building culture. Charity, can you enlighten us on some of the things for needs for your entry event? Oh.
Myla, before we jump into entry events, I'm going to quickly talk about a project calendar. And so that, what I'm posting right now for you to see is an example of a secondary level project calendar. And there's just a few things I want to point out here. First, the project begins with the entry event as we had described. So that's about creating a context for the learning that's going to take place in the project. Second, it's very common to have incremental deadlines prior to the end presentation or the end products. So this is about giving students an opportunity for revision and reflection so that their work has time for improvement before it's due. You're also going to notice that there are lessons scheduled, workshops scheduled, mini sessions scheduled, homework, deadlines, guest speakers, things of that nature. So it's a lot of teachers, when they first see a sample calendar like this, they're surprised because they have this conception that projects are about really exciting entry event, hooking kids in, and then letting them figure it out on their own. We actually believe that it's okay and encouraged to tightly scaffold the project process. So this project calendar is a good example of the ebb and flow of a project from day to day. Now, from an elementary standpoint, you would also see really tight scaffolding in a project calendar. Particularly, you would see elementary friendly writers' workshops and readers' workshops used almost on a daily basis. And so what's happening there is that teachers are asking students to engage with texts that are contextualized by the project and engage in writing tasks that are relevant to the project. And so the project really does become this contextualizing force in a secondary project-based learning experience and in an elementary PBL experience. So let's talk about entry events. This comic is brought to you by wishfulteaching.org, and it's a friendly reminder of why it's so important to teach content in the context of a project. So projects are initiated by a powerful entry event. Entry events should engage and intrigue students in the project content and process. So again, resist your urge to pre-teach content preceding a project. Rather, ensure your project is firmly rooted in a scope of significant content and go ahead and get started on the first day with your entry event. So what could be a good entry event? Myla, do you want to talk about that?
Well, I really love this slide because it makes me think of, imagine a classroom and you have all the kids there and you go in and you're really, really excited. And you come up to the class and you say, today we are going to learn about mitosis and cell structure. Now after you say that, how many of you or your students jump for joy when you heard that announcement? Think about it. How you begin or launch your project-based learning unit is key to really capturing your students and creating that need to inquire and learn throughout the project. Especially for elementary, with my experience with elementary, I tend to think, that is what hooks them. And having a middle school student, my own children, thinking about my own son, if that doesn't hook him right away, then he's lost for the project. So the entry event becomes a key part, and you really want to think about what kind of entry events that you're going to be sharing or launching your project with. Charity, could you share some examples?
Sure. So there's lots of different formats for an entry event. Here's a list, certainly not an exhaustive list, but these are some common types. Some teachers have even seen couple, 2 or more of these entry event types to really get kids engaged in the project purpose and the project outcomes and get kids asking questions. So when you're thinking about what type of entry event should I select for my project, what would really make sense? I'd like to remind you that it's not necessarily enough to select something that's cool or even something that's topical to the project. For example, you might have a project about the nature of industrialized agriculture and you select the documentary film Food Inc. because it's topical and it's an interesting film. But let's take a deeper look at what an entry event should do and then ask ourselves whether or not that film would be enough. So I believe that an entry event should create a need to know in your students. That means that when the entry event is over, students should understand the outcomes and products that are associated with the project. Meaning after the entry event is over, they should be able to articulate what the outcome is. What is the product, presentation, performance, or service they're going to create at the end? What is the purpose behind the project? That's the second thing students should be able to articulate. Why are we doing this? Why should we care? And the third thing a good entry event should do is cause students to ask questions. So if, for example, you just selected a topical film that's interesting, they might have some questions. They might understand vaguely that there's a problem, but do they really understand what they're going to have to create at the end of the project? Not really. So if you have a great entry event item that you'd like to use because it's topical and because you think kids might buy into it, great, but you might need to couple it with something else. Myla, do you want to talk a little bit about the elementary standpoint?
I'd love to. Like secondary, a variety of entry events can be used to begin your project. Your students will get more engaged and take ownership of the project if you launch it with an event that really grabs their hearts and their minds. That's a difference between secondary and elementary, is that for K2, it might not just be one event that's going to grab it. You're going to probably need more than one. You might actually need several. For younger children, it takes a little longer for them to grab on to the idea, the focus, and the purpose of your project. So you might need to do a series of things to build on that. They might have no experience. Younger kids, they might have no experience with the topic. In fact, they might not be interested in it. And the third thing is, younger children, have a wide variety of prior knowledge. For early elementary students, you need to sort of make that concrete for them. They may not be able to see themselves creating the product or the presentation that you have planned for 3 weeks in the distant future. 3 weeks for a 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old can be eternity for them. So in that case, for elementary kids, especially the younger ones, you need to take a moment beforehand to explore the topic through some hands-on activities, giving them some experience before they actually focus more into the work.
Okay, so actually, Rhonda Jessen just asked a great question. In the chat section, she says, we wonder about the students being able to state the outcomes and output after the entry event. Could you give us an example? And yes, we can. We're going to give you two. We're going to give you a secondary and an elementary. Here is the secondary example. So this is an example of what we would call a mock correspondence style of entry event. And that's where you create a contrived or perhaps a real document. Ideally, it would be an authentic document to launch the project. And so frequently they're memos or challenge documents or problem statements or design briefs, things of that nature. So here's an example from a middle school math project. And so what you're going to notice, to answer your question directly, Rhonda, is, let's see if we can find it here. So it looks like the principal has taped off a 3-by-5 foot section of the wall right outside his office, and he's in search for an original piece of interdisciplinary artwork. He says, in 2 weeks, your teams will present their original masterpieces to me and my panel, and they will be selecting the equations of art that best represent the school. So then it talks a little bit more about what students should be submitting. And at the end, he says, look, I'm looking for an original artwork that will spruce up the entrance to the office. And so at the end of this entry event, students should be able to say, well, I need to turn in to the principal my math-based artwork and my equations for each of the line segments in my drawing. So that would be a good example of students being able to articulate what they're going to turn in at the end of the project. The purpose has to do with school personality, and then I bet they have a lot of questions. Questions about how to do this, questions about how it will be graded, questions about who they'll work with, questions about how to use math to create art, all types of questions. So that's what we want. We want students to understand the purpose, we want students to understand what they're going to produce at the end, and we want students to have questions. Okay, Myla, let's look at an elementary example.
Now the example that you have in front of you is a sample letter that was used as an entry event when I taught 3rd grade. I just did this like last year because I was teaching in a multi-age classroom, and I specifically worked with 3rd grade students that particular year. So it was for a geography lesson that was integrating art and technology. The letter actually came from a travel agent who would later bring his agency as a panel of experts for our final presentation. Now, I wanted to do an entry event initially, basically to get them interested in it, and I thought this would be a great way of also showing an example of letter writing, especially in the early elementary grades. What I did was I started out going to a travel agency to ask them basically to use their stationery, and then the travel agent owner ended up coming back and asking me what it was for. After we had this conversation, they really bought into this whole idea of project-based learning and asked if their agency could go on board with this project. So I was trying to create this very pseudo authentic piece with the stationery, ended up becoming very an authentic project itself because of the travel agent. Now, getting back to that topic of knowing the purpose, after we read this letter with the students, the kids, I asked them what their needs to know. What do you need to know to make this happen? And they were able to clearly say, you know, we will need to know our geography. We will need to have an understanding of what it means to think green and to use things digitally. And it was fascinating because one of my students even raised her hand and said, Mrs. Lee, we need to know how to persuade. We need to know how to persuade. So they even brought in all the different subject areas within our classroom to make this happen. So well-constructed entry event, knowing what the end in mind is that you want for the students, as long as you put some of those pieces within the entry event, many times those students can pull those pieces out of the entry event, especially with elementary, with your guidance.
Great. So let's take a look at our need to know regarding how to create teams for a project. There are several different strategies for secondary and for elementary. We'll start with secondary PBL. So certainly there's no one right approach to teaming kids, but let's go over a few tips from the trenches. First, the Fantastic Four. We generally recommend teams of 4. This number allows for collaboration, it allows for innovation, even sometimes democratic processes. In larger groups of 5 or larger, we find that students have difficulty coordinating work or that the work gets spread too thin. In terms of smaller groups, sometimes groups of 3 can be successful. And if for whatever reason teams of 4 don't work for your classroom, teams of 3 would be our second choice. We also recommend heterogeneous grouping. We believe that homogeneous is only good for milk. So create groups with opportunities for peer scaffolding of content and understanding, groups in which students have the opportunity to shine with respect to their personal strengths. In terms of selecting teams, we believe that you should choose teams or co-manage the process. For example, in some cases, students are more experienced in PBL. They've done a few projects, they've worked in teams, and so in that case, it might be more common to see teachers co-managing the teaming process at the beginning of a project. I've seen teachers team by role. For example, you might have 4 group roles. One project I like to cite as an example of this is a wing design challenge project done at Aviation High School in Highline School District south of Seattle. And so there were 3 roles in this project: project manager, test engineer, and design engineer. So students got to select their role, and then the teacher proceeded to ask the students to find their complete team of the 2 other roles. So that could be a good example. Another way you could co-manage the teaming process is to allow students to team by position. Perhaps you have a controversial type of project where students are going to have to take a side. If they take their side or their position at the beginning, they can team by position or by side. Also, we've seen some schools go as far to create a culture of hiring in which project managers are selected by the teacher, and then the project managers proceed to quote unquote hire their team. Picture a mock job fair following the entry event where students bring their applications, fill out job applications, project managers interview potential team members, and engage in a hiring bonanza. Pretty cool. Myla, teaming can look different in the elementary grades. Can you discuss some best practices?
Absolutely, Charity. In elementary, the number of team members depends on the project and the grade level. For kindergarten to second grade, initially most or all of the project may be completed in whole group using very guided and explicit scaffolding. Upper elementary, such as my classroom and up, might have 3 to 4 members per team. Like secondary, it's important to have a variety of learning styles, reading abilities, leadership, and skills on a team. Just like you, homogeneous is out. With secondary, heterogeneous teams are ideal. You want to be strategic in how you group your students. You want kids, especially in elementary, you want them to be able to be supportive of each other. This is such a learning environment for them for those formative years. They're so impressionable at that age. If students are English learners, group them with another team member who speaks their native language, or students who have that strong communication or compassionate heart, to include them in the work. Teachers scaffold the degree they manage the teams based on the project and the student's experience with the project-based learning. In my classroom, by the third or fourth project, my students have more of a procedural knowledge with how the whole process works. So in terms of that, they know exactly what their strengths are and what areas that they lack. And so in forming the teams, they can, in how they process with me, they can pretty much tell me, they can be verbal in knowing where they're going with their project. Creating a culture of collaboration in elementary, it pretty much starts before you even launch the project. We talked about this before. That entire team building piece starts on the very first day of school. You spend, if your students are not used to working in teams, you're going to spend a little extra time on that. You're going to spend extra time in making sure that they understand what it means to be a team member. For very young children, you're going to need to do a mini lesson every time you want to resume working in teams. You're going to model their tasks, and you're going to give clear directions before they even get started, even if it's the same task as the day before. Again, for elementary kids, you really want to make it concrete, visual, and consistent.
Okay, so let's take a look at project documents. This is in terms of our second need to know regarding how do I manage all of the project documents and all the paperwork involved in PBL. Myla, do you want to talk about elementary first?
Yes, I'd love to. For elementary, your project documents need to be passed out as an as-needed basis. Nothing scares a child when all of a sudden you hand them 10 to 15 sheets of paper that they need to do. Many times for elementary kids, they don't even have the organizational skills to handle all that. Each document needs to be clearly explained and have a place to be stored, such as a team or individual folder. Now, how you complete the documents needs to be modeled, especially with lower elementaries. That's where that whole workshop model, if you use it in your classroom, comes into play, because you use that mini lesson, that introduction piece, to model exactly how you're going to be using or completing that element of that project. In early L, you're most likely going to do this as a whole class. Having a central place, such as a table or center area, helps in the management of materials. In my classroom, I tend to do a lot of color coding, and I use a lot of pictures and to help visually, especially for my non-readers and my EL students, my English language students. That becomes very handy for them, just to get that visual piece and having the same place every time for them to go to. Again, consistency and clarity. Charity, how do you handle project documents in secondary?
The infamous project documents. We certainly recommend transparency. We believe that you should share these documents with students, but how do you best share it without overwhelming students? Imagine an engaging entry event. Imagine documenting all of the students' need to knows, and then walking around the classroom and dropping project packets on students' desks with an ominous thud. Not really your engaging project starter for middle school and high school students. In fact, project packets can make projects just feel like more work. So I'd love to share an example from my own classroom that I learned a lot from. In my first project, I must have spent 112 minutes in the staff room photocopying project packets with 17 pages of front and back, single-spaced, 7.5 Times New Roman font with narrow margins of neatly organized project information. I thought I was pretty high speed, but as you can imagine, students didn't think I was as high speed as I thought I was. For the next 3 weeks during the project, I found remnants of my beloved project packets in the classroom trash, littering the cafeteria, and forgotten at home. Lesson learned, secondary students can have a shutdown mechanism that is activated at 412 word count and 8.7 ounces. So avoid activating their shutdown mechanism. Save some paper and save some of your own time in the photocopy room. Let's go over best practices in project document distribution. One way of sharing project documents without overwhelming students might be the use of a project wall. These are some key items that could be on your project wall. What's nice here is that you can make a copy, just one, of each of your key project documents and post them in a project wall or a project center in your classroom. I do recommend to avoid the urge of going over your project wall with students. Snooze alert. Trust that when there is a need to know, students will be able to use the wall as needed. I can't tell you how many times I've walked into PBL classrooms throughout the United States and observed groups of students hovering around a project wall. They use it to double check deadlines, access suggested resources, or find rubrics to review their work in progress. So the wall is being used by students as needed in relationship to their need to knows as the project progresses. No need to go over it. Myla, can you share a little bit about project walls in the elementary grades?
Absolutely, Charity. For elementary grades, I have to tell you that that project wall is a must. It has the same information as a secondary project wall, but you have to keep in mind for elementary grades, it's a very visual focal point for a project. When you add colors and pictures and graphics to help organize the different parts of this project, especially for younger children who can't read yet, it becomes very important. For the first time project, the project wall becomes your central location for modeling and teaching and resources. I use the workshop model in my classroom, and so I've used my project wall to meet with my students briefly. And note, I said briefly because just as Charity mentioned, it can be a snooze alert. But I use it as a recap of our project and to get a status of our class, and to get an idea where are my teams at, and to set the purpose for the day.
Excellent. So notice how this teacher also uses a post-it note strategy with her calendar. Don't you love unscheduled assemblies, snow days, hey, even in Texas, and unforeseen changes to the schedule? I don't either, but they happen. So teachers can simplify their use of the project calendar and adjust very quickly and be flexible to unscheduled changes by just pushing post-it notes forward if need be. So that might be a good strategy. This teacher actually color-coded her post-it notes, which is great. She was using yellow post-it notes for student work time or student-directed time on the calendar, pink post-it notes for lessons that she would give, or teacher-directed, teacher-structured time, and orange post-it notes for assessments, primarily formative assessments that were used for work in progress. Obviously, that particular calendar is still in development. I snuck into her room to take a picture while she was building it, but hopefully that's still a useful tool for you. So another great another great strategy in terms of distributing project documents would be to use digital project walls. Here are some favorite and mostly free websites that you can use to create digital project walls. I've seen some phenomenal Glogster project walls. They can be time-consuming to create, but they're great, amazing, student-friendly feeling walls. So what's nice is that students can access project work from home and at school, especially if you have high technology access.
You know what, am I on right now, Charity? Just want to make sure. Oh, for upper elementary, for this piece, I want to share that technology, especially in my district, we do have access to technology, and I use it a lot for those kids who are absent, and to actually, what I've done now is integrate a lot of technology with this piece. And I use a wiki space, and I have used Glogster, and I also use Edmodo as a piece for our project wall. For elementary students who are almost always under the age of 13, I have personally found Edmodo to be an excellent secure platform for having our project pieces there. I use it for the process, and I also am now using it with the folders as the process for having a project wall there. But I've seen Charity's examples of Glogster digital posters, and they're pretty amazing because I've actually used that because it looks very similar to what you could have in an offline classroom. For an elementary student, it really does visually attract them in terms of the project and the components of a project. Charity, can you share about the checkpoints in a project as well?
Sure. So the big idea here, and this is applicable and relevant to both secondary and to elementary, is during the planning stage, an important part of managing your project is to set deadlines for when students should complete each step in the project-based learning journey. These checkpoints are occasions for formative assessment, for feedback, for critique, and for reflection. They are followed by revisions. Keep in mind that if you don't build into place this type of structure, their first try will be their final try. Myla, do you want to talk about checkpoints some more?
Sure. Hold on. Ouch, I'm sorry. My leg fell asleep. So, in terms of project checkpoints, for me, I have students submit artifacts such as research notes, drafts of written work, storyboards for videos and sketches and plans, models, prototypes, and products. We basically decide what the major milestones are by working backwards from the project endpoint. We mark progress on a project calendar, and we use a visual aid such as Post-it notes. We note the milestones, and I use this basically also as a formative assessment of how successful their project is and where they're at.
Okay, so I'm just responding to some questions here. Keep them coming. We love that. So I want to remind you that if the structure is not built in for the PBL element of feedback and revision, it probably won't happen all by itself. If we really want students to produce high quality work, we have to build in the structure for feedback and revision. So these types of checkpoints disable procrastination and they enable higher quality work. So as you think about the end product students will produce, unpack them into sub-product steps and checkpoints in which students can share their work in progress, get feedback, and make it better before it's due. So in secondary PBL, it's common to assign group roles. Common roles include project manager, team leader, communication specialist, research guru, design lead, creative lead, technology specialist. You can pick the top 4 relevant roles for your project depending on its topic, depending on its problem, depending on its sort of authentic anchor. So we also frequently see roles based on career connections built into the project. Think about that Wing Design Challenge project that used roles such as test engineer and design engineer. Why? Because those are the titles of engineers who build wings. In another project, the driving question was, how can we raise awareness about a social issue in our community? That project had roles such as editor and campaign manager. Those are real world professional titles that are relevant to the project. Once you have roles in place, it saves you time and enables smarter management. For example, if you want to scaffold the use of a new technology tool, or just meet with the, you can just meet with the tech specialists. So instead of stopping the whole class and teaching a whole class lesson on a singular technology tool, you can just meet with that small group of students from each team. They can take it back to their team as specialists. Or better yet, you can set up a breakout training facilitated by your school's media specialist, your school's librarian, or a subject matter expert. So you don't always have to be the beast of burden here as you use these roles to your advantage and save some time. Also, perhaps you want to check in on a research topic at a midpoint in the project. Perhaps consider facilitating a meeting with all of your research gurus. They can share research and you can share research resources with them as well. Myla, how does this strategy of team representatives play out in the elementary grades?
Trying to answer some questions here, but in terms of the team representatives, Charity, in elementary, basically those are formative years, and we're really using that time to teach leadership and communication skills. So a lot of that is happening when you do your when you meet with the groups. In elementary, you have more of a chance to work one-on-one with those students, because in elementary we have them pretty much all day. So this is a time where we are modeling some of those 21st century skills. For the entire class, you might teach the mini lesson, which might include the content or 21st century skill that you want the students to learn. During that time, you're going to go to the different groups and you're going to model that to your team representatives. And you're going to use that scaffolding process in which you are going to let go of some of that control, and after you've modeled it to your team leaders and representatives, so they have an idea. The idea of having naming jobs and roles in elementary is just as important, because we're trying to create an authentic environment for these kids, and that plays a big part in that. So as you're talking to as you're talking to those team representatives, as you're scaffolding the entire process, you're touching base on their project. You're doing a lot of things as elementary teachers that you do naturally, but you're using this time for the team representative to also teach them those skills, because many of those, especially in early L, haven't really learned those skills. They still need to be taught what those skills mean and what it means to be a leader in a team setting. So Charity, could you touch base on the next slide, which is on individual accountability?
Sure. And we're going to try to speed things up a little bit because this is billed as an hour webinar and we want to make sure we stay on time. But what I'd like to say here in terms of individual accountability is just a few key tips to make this happen. First, you can select both individual and group products to be completed. In a project, not all products should be group products and not all products should be individual products. Balance it out. That will help ensure individual accountability. Use roles to your advantage. That allows students to divide tasks better to make sure there is individual accountability. And also, if there are problems, if group work is not occurring with all individual participation, use the team's contracts to enforce accountability. Instead of you stepping in and sort of micromanaging the process, you could step in and rather mediate the use of the student's own contract to ensure individual accountability. Myla, can you share a few quick tips about this slide as well?
Absolutely. Now, with individual accountability for for elementary, we tend to, in elementary, we do have contracts, but they're more like norms. We still want contracts to make it, to have a seriousness about it in terms of that this is a workplace and we mean serious business, even in elementary. But we also, because it's the beginning of the year, we're developing those team building activities. It becomes a live document that I have in my classroom in which I actually write down what makes a team successful. These become the norms. And what I do with that is we choose 4 or 5 of those that we will use in the contract that the group actually signs and agrees upon. Now in K2, you're going to manage this more. You're pretty much going to model and scaffold each of those norms of what it looks like, what you are looking for, what it sounds like. Now in upper elementary, I start to scaffold and give them a little bit more control in the process. So what I will do is, like, I will choose maybe 1 or 2 things that are non-negotiable norms. So such as be prepared for a team meeting. That's a non-negotiable. The rest of the norms can be chosen and discussed as a group. For example, in my classroom, I have one child who is always late and never seems to be on time with getting the work in. That team in particular created a norm saying, have your work turned in on time. That was very specific. Now keep in mind, this is probably the 3rd project into it. They've gotten to know each other. They've gotten to know the expectations of a project. So that is one way that in elementary that we have accountability with our projects. The
Excellent.
next thing, oops.
Please continue, Myla.
Okay, the next thing, I'm going to start off the slide talking about avoiding death by repetitive presentations. You need to keep in mind that to help keep the novelty and interest, not only for your students, but also for the audience and even for you, from one presentation to the next, you need to avoid repetition over and over. For example, multiple presentations on the same topic and in the same format will limit voice and choice. And on top of that, I don't know about you, if I had to sit through 10 project PowerPoint presentations on the same ecosystem, I think I'd go a little nuts. But perhaps giving choice on the type of ecosystem to research would not only vary the need to know, but think about your audience. If they had multiple ecosystems to learn from, think about the learning that would go on in your classroom because you've offered variety and choice. Charity, could you add a little bit more with secondary?
Sure, absolutely, Myla. As a PBL teacher, if this happened to me, I would reflect on a few things in terms of my project design and rollout. Like, for example, was my driving question truly open-ended? Or was I leading students to a singular right answer or perhaps to my answer? If indeed I was leading students, I might end up getting a bunch of repetitive presentations. So it's important to write an open-ended driving question and support the open-ended nature of that driving question. Second, I would ask, did I build in opportunities for in-depth inquiry, or was the inquiry shallow, information gathering and regurgitation? Deeper inquiry involves asking questions, investigating information and evidence in a variety of sources, interpreting that information and evidence, asking more questions, and then ending the inquiry by developing novel solutions, novel original answers. So shallow inquiry means I go get a bunch of information and tell it back to you. If the inquiry is indeed shallow, you're going to get these repetitive fact-based presentations. So as a teacher and as a project designer, you can ask yourself, how am I scaffolding an in-depth inquiry process? Third, you can ask yourself, did I build in feedback loops in which I was able to review student work and enable feedback for improvement? If you did build in these checkpoints or these feedback loops, you would know early on that all of the students are going in the same direction and you would be able to be responsive before the end of the project. So that's really important. Lastly, ask yourself if this occurs to you, did I build in sufficient opportunities for voice and choice? How were students allowed to share their voice, their answer, their perspective, their solution to the problem? How were they able to make choices about the project process and about the products, performances, presentations, or services that they culminated the project in? So Myla, do you want to talk a little bit about this slide, missing school or missing the point?
Yes, I'm just going to briefly touch on that because Charity, we're going to we need to really speed up based on the time that I'm getting from.
Sure.
So I just want to touch on the missing school or missing the point. In elementary, especially for the early grades, one way to address that whole piece of missing the point and missing school is just basically routinely meeting at that project wall. I mentioned that it's a must. It's really important that they meet and you actually recap what's going on every single time. Because in elementary you are with those kids a lot. You have a sense of what they know and what they're not, and you're going to use that moment to mediate and to work with them. In addition, one of the norms that can be embedded in a team contract is a method in which team members help each other get caught up when someone is absent. The question to ask is, what can we do as a team to make sure that we are all active participants? Again, that whole piece of creating that team culture is important. And in terms of missing the point, there's a lot with that workshop method that we can go back and we do a lot of reteaching as well. Charity?
Good. So I'm just going to share 3 quick tips if this occurs to you. Go back to the team contract to resolve the issue because we want to empower our students to solve the problem on their own. You could step in to mediate or micromanage the team tasks and time so that the students don't have to be the ones who make sure the slacker is doing all the work. Or further in your PBL career, you could play what we call slacker hardball and put students who are not deeply engaging in projects together in a team on the next projects so that they all have to step up. But in an extreme case, you might actually have to play the real world hardball, and that means you're fired. So we certainly don't recommend firing in the elementary grades. Firing is only relevant to the secondary grades. But the big idea here is to help students work in teams. Students can essentially pick up where their team left off, or they can start the project over if they are fired from a team. In some schools, students are allowed to take their resumes around and try to get hired on by another team. So it would be important to have a firing pipeline that outlines how firing protocols take place and what happens if a student is fired from a team. Last day, self and peer assessments. Keep in mind here that the project doesn't end with the exhibition of culminating products or the delivery of culminating presentation. It ends after that, when students reflect on the learning and the process. Common reflection questions include, what did I learn from this project? What will I take away from me, with me as an enduring understanding? And what did I learn about myself as a learner? So, Myla, any thoughts on last day for the elementary grade?
In terms of elementary, one thing again, because it's those formative years, what I found to be very powerful is an actual whole group reflective class meeting. I find that modeling that reflective thinking for the initial PBL experience it allows you to dig deeper using questioning strategies that kids probably wouldn't come up with initially. You really do need to model for that. Like Charity said, the project doesn't end with the exhibition. We need to celebrate the students' learning and pretty much also ours as PBL teachers.
All right, so here were some of our need to knows. We hope that we've given you some information about each of these that can help you manage your projects. We're going to try to move into a Q&A session here in the event that any of you have any questions following what you've heard so far. I'm going to share a few resources where they could find additional answers to their questions.
Okay, yes. You know what? First of all, we want to thank you for just even coming to this webinar, just sharing this topic is really important to both of us. We know you may have additional questions that you may want to share. We want to share where you can find some of these answers. Many of you are very familiar with the BIE.org website. That is a phenomenal website to go to because it has a do-it-yourself section in which you can download some information, many of the forms that are in the book, just to get started and get through the initial process of your first PBL unit. We have publications such as the starter kits, PBL in the elementary grades as well. Those not only answer a lot of your questions, but it gives wonderful exemplars for what you could be doing with your project. The elementary, speaking in terms as an elementary teacher, that elementary grade PBL in elementary grades has been very useful because there are actual units in place there to help you see the entire process. Another place where you can have some excellent resources is the Edmodo community. I don't know how many of you have participated in that. Could you raise your hand if you've actually are part of the Edmodo community for project-based learning? Excellent. So far we have 2 people. If you haven't joined, please do so. It's a great place just even to ask a question and say, I have this unit that I want to do. Can someone help me out? And there's also national faculty there who are monitoring the community and answering some of those questions. Now, if you're interested in booking a PBL 101 workshop, which many of you already have, for your school or site for deeper training and understanding, please contact Lauren Scheller, our coordinator of professional services. She's at lauren@bie.org, so if you need any other information, she's a great person to talk to about that. Charity?
Great. So we've had some really good questions coming up over here in Q&A. Sounds like a lot of people had some of their questions answered already through the process of the webinar, which is fabulous. I'm glad a lot of you got some good resources as you asked questions and we responded to them in chat. Wonderful. A good question by Rhonda up in Alberta, and we've worked together in person, so it's nice to see you again. But her team is mulling about the differences between project-based learning, problem-based learning, inquiry-based learning. And there are some differences, but we believe that primarily those are subsets of project-based learning. Any other questions? Okay, so a lot of you know that this webinar and all of the other webinars that BIE facilitates are available to you in 2 places. On our YouTube channel, the BIE PBL YouTube channel, as well as in our Edmodo project-based learning community. And so those are free resources. You can go and watch any of those webinars on demand to get some of your questions about project-based learning design.